This is our teaching video for the third Sunday in Lent, March the 8th, 2015. The majority, if not the entirety of our video will be about Jerusalem and especially the temple. We'll talk on Sunday about the Ten Commandments and Paul and his interpretation of the cross. But in our story from the Gospel of John, we have the cleansing of the temple. And the first thing to notice is that the story happens in John chapter 2, right after the wedding at Cana. Now, if you think about it, usually we talk about the cleansing of the temple at the end of the story of the Gospels. Jesus goes to Jerusalem for the final time, and during the week of the Passion, he cleanses the temple. But notice on Sunday, Jesus' public ministry begins with the cleansing of the temple. He goes to Jerusalem and cleans the place. And one of the things that Jesus is going to do is equate the temple as the place of God's presence and dwelling with himself. So there's going to be this argument about by whose authority do you cleanse the temple? And Jesus says, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will tell you. That will be the sign. By whose authority? And they say, this temple's been built for 46 years. How can you say that to us? And the fact that we have this date here actually helps us in the chronology of John, saying that John was probably locating the story, or the story in John is located during around 27 to 29 AD because of this little detail. And in fact, John's Gospel is the Gospel we have that allows us to say that Jesus' ministry was 3 years, because he has Jesus returning to Jerusalem for 3 distinct Passovers. So just keep this little detail in mind, that the cleansing of the temple happens very early in the Gospel of John, and then ask yourself, what does that mean? Alright, so here's a model of the temple in Jerusalem, and this model itself is in Jerusalem. The temple proper is this building here in the center. This larger platform was added onto by Herod just to expand the center of the temple and its function in the city. So it included these colonnades that were added and this Antonia fortress named after Mark Antony. And a reminder, this is the second temple. So the first temple was built during the time of Solomon, destroyed by the Babylonians in 587 BC. The second temple was built after the exile, after they returned from Babylon, and will be destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD. It's precisely these courts where Jesus does his cleansing of the animals and money changers. Not inside this part of the temple, but in these larger courts where business was conducted. And one of the things that we know is that the temple wasn't just a religious center, but it was a center for commerce as well. Here's a more close-up picture of the temple complex itself. The reason I wanted to show you this is some of the stories from the gospel you're familiar with have to deal with these buildings around the temple. So for example, when Jesus cleanses the 10 lepers and says, go show yourselves to the priests, this is the chamber of the lepers where they would have come and done that. When Judas commits suicide and they say, do not use the money we gave him for the temple treasury, this is where they collected that money. Or the widow and her mite, this is where they collected that money. When Jesus is found as a child listening to the teachers after his parents leave during the time of the festival, he was probably found here in this corner where they did teaching during festival times. So I just wanted to remind you that these stories have a place where they happened that we can connect with. This is a picture of the first temple of Solomon, and the design of the building itself is essentially the same. What I wanted to show you is the altar here and also the washing place, because when Jesus cleanses the temple of animals of the herd, the flock, and the birds, they were destined for the altar here. And depending on what kind of offering they were, dictated how they would be used. So for example, if they were a burnt offering, they would be completely burned on this altar. One of the interesting things to note is the animals are on a sliding scale. If you're very wealthy, you can afford an ox to sacrifice. Less wealthy, an animal of the flock. And if you're poor, one of the birds. And so you'll notice when Mary is cleansed in the temple, after giving birth to Jesus, she offers the birds, which is a socioeconomic indicator of where Mary and Joseph are when Jesus is born. So maybe like many young parents, they're poor. Right, just to kind of look at the city of Jerusalem really quick. Now we have the temple from the other side. So here's the Mount of Olives, Garden of Gethsemane. That's where we were looking at that first model. Here's the Pool of Siloam, that famous story where Jesus cleanses the man there. Here's the palace where Herod would have met Jesus during his passion. The cross is out here, outside the city walls. And here's the praetorium where Jesus would have met Pilate, where Pilate would have pronounced his judgment from Gabbatha, the stone pavement, and where Jesus would have been flogged. All right, well, now we can talk a little bit about the money changers. So the animals have that sacrificial function, but what about the money changers? And there's a few things that we can say. Because the temple was a center of commerce, you had a lot of foreign currency that needed to be exchanged, and that would be done at the temple by the money changers. So people were coming from Rome, people were coming from provinces, there were different kinds of coins that needed to be exchanged. The second thing we can say is every Jewish male over the age of 20 or 20 and above had to pay the temple tax. And that's something that Moses gives as a law in Exodus. And the temple tax is a half shekel per year per adult male. Now, you may remember the story of Jesus finding the fish with the coin in its mouth, and what he finds in that fish's mouth is 1 shekel, and you could pay the tax of 2 men with 1 shekel. So notice Jesus pays the tax of himself and Peter when people are asking. So to pay the temple tax was considered an obligation, a lawful obligation of every male, and it was a half shekel per year per male, and you could use 1 shekel and pay for 2 men. Now, during the time of Jesus, the coin that was used was called the Tyrian shekel. And here we see the reason it was called the Tyrian shekel is, well, A, it's a shekel, but B, it's from the city of Tyre. Tyre, that famous city of trade just to the west in the Mediterranean, oftentimes decried by the prophets and by the voice of God through the prophets. On one side of the coin is a picture of Tyre, kind of the lord of the city, also known as Heracles. So depending on who you're talking to, they might have a different opinion of what to call him. The people of Tyre might call him Baal. The people of Greece would call him Heracles, like Hercules, and then some of the Jews would actually call this Beelzebub. Here you see on the back side the name Tyre in Greek, and also the holy city and the eagle. Now, one of the things to know about the Tyrian shekel is from about 130, 140 BC to the time that the temple is destroyed, this becomes the coin that all the money is changed into. One of the reasons that happens is it was almost pure silver, 94% pure silver. So even when the Romans came in and they shut down the mint in Tyre, the Jews were allowed to continue to produce the Tyrian shekel because Roman coins were about 80% pure. So one of the reasons this remained the standard was its purity, and the rabbis would say, well, even though there's an idolatrous picture of a face, that's actually less important than the fact that we have been commanded to pay the temple tax, and that law is more important than worrying about who's on the coin. So using this pure silver, converting the money into the silver, is more important than other concerns. Now, we might say that within Judaism there would be probably a diversity of voices on that topic, but certainly we know that a lot of brisk business was done with this particular shekel from Tyre. Well, one of the things we know is that Jesus interrupts the temple economy, and the temple wasn't just a place for foreign currency, but really acted as a safe deposit box for the wealth of the nation too. So people's cloth, people's gold, all of this stuff, it converges in the same place. The marketplace, the religious sacred place, and the place of government, it all kind of came into the same place. And not only can we say it has that function, but remember, from Mount Sinai to the tabernacle, so that's the tent of meeting, to the temple, and now to Jesus, he claims, and we believe, we have this question of presence. So we can talk about the temple as a place of riches, but really what we're interested in is the temple as the place of God's presence. This is what is the main question. Where is it that God can be reliably found? And we go from Mount Sinai to the tabernacle to the temple, and finally Jesus says, the dwelling place of God is me. And then as I bring people into myself as part of the church, then I will dwell with them, and they shall be my people. We might say a feature of the story that coordinates with this is when Jesus is crucified and the curtain in the temple is torn in two, signifying that God's presence is now available to the world in a new way. So hopefully this little tour of Jerusalem gave you some things to think about, and will give you something to imagine when we hear the scripture on Sunday. We'll see you then as we gather in the Father's house.